Welcome, everyone. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the Michigan State University African Studies Center. Today, we're very fortunate to be having an Eye on Africa speaker who's also launching our two-day Campus Activism for Justice from Southern Africa to Michigan conference. I'm delighted to welcome Somadoda Fikeni, who's going to be talking with us about contemporary political issues in South Africa. As I mentioned, this is the first event of a two-day event celebrating and commemorating the 40th anniversary of Michigan State University's decision to divest from companies doing business in South Africa and supporting the South African apartheid regime. Let me tell you something about Somadoda Fikeni, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll give you a preview of some of the other events that are planned for the next couple of days. First of all, Somadoda Fikeni is a Spartan. He has a PhD from MSU, and it's delightful to welcome you back and to speak with us. Dr. Fikeni is an expert and a specialist on political science, public policy development, and analysis of history, political economy, and heritage, and he's a recognized and sought-after political commentator in various media and public forums. He has received numerous awards and honors in South Africa and overseas, among them in 2007 being given an honorary chiefship in Ghana. He's not only a policy analyst and a media expert, he's also an activist, which is one of the reasons it's so important for us to have him here with us for these 2 days. He has initiated community development and charity organizations assisting the poor and the disadvantaged. He has an Ubuntu charity organization mobilizing and distributing resources to people in rural communities. He's also continued to be a scholar. He's an honorary professor at UNISA in South Africa, and in fact, he was voted as the #1 political analyst in South Africa through a South Africa FM program. He is also a member of the BRICS Think Tank Forum, has been a chairperson of the Eminent Persons Groups on Sports Transformation in South Africa, chairing the South African Heritage Resources Agency, many other public forums, institutions, and organizations. In fact, his CV is so long that it would take the entire hour probably for me to tell you of his many accomplishments. Let me go no further and let him tell us about contemporary political issues in South Africa. Welcome back to MSU, Somadoda Fikeni.
Thank you very much, Program Director, for these generous words of introduction. Sometimes when you get introduced, you wish you had recorded the person so that when you go to the next interview, you can just play the clip. It's such an honor to be invited back to your institution. It's a form of validation. Even when you receive so many invitations elsewhere, coming back to the place that assisted in shaping you, more so with my supervisor, Michael Bratton, being here. And I went to South Ketsi yesterday to retrace my steps. Many of the leaders who were here, like Dave Wiley, his wife is here. John Mazla at least has been coming to Southern Africa, and we've been hosting him every other second year. So it's like we've been seeing you guys very often. And I also would like to recognize our Consular General in Chicago, who will be speaking to us this evening. And of course, everyone here, you're so special, and I recognize you. I've been asked to speak on the broad subject. When I saw the invitation initially, I got scared. Eye on Africa. Said Africa is so complex, and there are so many changes taking place. But at least as I read the invitation, it indicated that I have to focus on the contemporary South African politics, which is equally complex. As South Africa, we're a very noisy, argumentative, sometimes temperamental democracy. Sometimes we generate more heat than light because of the dynamics of issues. But before I say that, I should recognize, as I've said in my previous 2 lectures, when I delivered the Nelson Mandela lecture in Dublin, Ireland, and more recently in Jamaica, University of West Indies, that South African struggle was one of the most internationalized struggle against apartheid. Therefore, it will take a very long time or a very short memory for us to forget the human spirit of solidarity. People who have never been to the country, I met one this morning, said he was part of the divestment movement, but he has never set foot there. So the human spirit of solidarity, will forever be grateful for that. Naturally, our transition to democracy attracted global attention. And Professor Bratton has written extensively on transitions. And South African transition was equally complex with mixed results. But being asked to focus on contemporary issues in South Africa, it's like being asked to paint a speed train whilst it is in full motion, and to show some precision, something which is very difficult. But what I'll do is just to highlight a few things and hope that we engage in greater detail when we are discussing. I just want to say one of the most attractive things which made South Africa a laboratory for many scholars studying transition was the fact that a country which was on the brink of a racial civil strife pulled itself back, had a homegrown negotiated settlement. It even experimented in a bold way with reconciliation. And I think that is Professor Geneva Smitherman as well. I can still recognize it. Yes. That you had this homegrown experiment with resolving conflict, of course, with a great deal of international support and pressure, with Nelson Mandela being this global statesman who was seen as a symbol and a protagonist of this process, made many other places around the world to take interest in South Africa, whether it was in the Balkan states, in Northern Ireland, in Israel and Palestine, and many other regions which were dealing with post-conflict issues. But in the South African transition, you'd be making a mistake if you say this is the outcome, because the results were quite mixed. But before I speak to some of these issues more directly, I just want to highlight some of the flaws we tend to have when we are analyzing the South African, perhaps any other transition. Sometimes we tend to give primacy to agency, who are the individual leaders, and we forget the deep structural issues. Sometimes we give primacy to the structures and we forget the individual actors. How the two interface is the most important thing to me. The second one in South Africa, which you'll find quite common, for some of the failures or the challenges that we still face, you'll find that some, particularly within the ruling party, will blame history on some of the issues that have not been attended, whereas the opposition party will blame the current policy choices. And I often say again, it's not an either-or situation, because both the historical, deep, structural issues have a role, but also the policy choices, policy mistakes also have a role. The other weakness has been something which I often call South African exceptionalism. It has denied most of scholars, particularly social scientists, an ability to compare with other post-colonial states some of the emerging trends, because we would then say this is a unique case. Once something is unique, you have no basis to compare it. That in itself has created challenges, and yet students of history were seeing some of the tendencies that had been there in the post-colonial societies. That too, I think, has been a big challenge. And the irony in this is that pre-1994, the white rulers in the country saw South Africa as geographically in Africa, but anything else was elsewhere. So they said it was an exception. Post-1994, those returning from exile and some who remained in the country said it was an exception because it was one of the last to be liberated. It had learned lessons and so forth. But there was no scientific basis for that. At times we deployed terms such as the South African miracle. And you know, once you deploy terms such as a miracle, you can't analyze a miracle. You touch something, it happens. It creates intellectual laziness to go behind facts. It makes people not to dig deeper and understand some of the dynamics during the transition. Some deployed terms such as Madiba magic. Again, these concepts are pregnant with meaning which is meaningless, because it says there was a magic. And very often then we gloss over some of the very complex dynamics which were to rear their heads sometime later. Then the next element in these tools of analysis, we often fail to measure and assess accurately what can be attributed to global factors and local factors. For example, the economy. If you have a global recession in 2008 and South Africa is a primary exporter of commodities, how does that impact the economy? Of course, there are many other layers to that. And of course, it doesn't make some of those who tend to blame everything to the global escape responsibility of what they ought to have done locally. And the last one, there could be more, but I just wanted to limit myself to these. Sometimes people say government has failed, government ought to have done this. We have seen this with corruption scandals, without ever looking in the direction of business. And yet the mutual penetration between business and politics, where you ought to be looking at corruption irrespective of where it is. In South Africa, we've seen that the patrimonial system, the patronage system, as well as corruption in the corporate sector. Now you can imagine in South Africa, it's one of the most concentrated business sectors. Each sector is dominated by 3 or 4 players, such as the audit firms. So when there is corruption there, literally, it has a massive impact. But the media has made us to believe that the only corruption we should be looking at is the one in government. Whereas this interpenetration, and of course those who are closer to President Zuma, the Guptas, they often say, no, this is not a business class. The moment they are corrupt, we have relegated them into something else. It's a business class. But now very quickly, when we look at our transition to democracy, here are the areas of success which generally there is consensus that we've done well in that space. 1, the setting up of the infrastructure and institutions of democracy. It was one of the big successes of South Africa. These include your judiciary, the checks and balances. These include what we call the Chapter 9 institutions, such as the public protector and so forth. And their independence has become the last line of defense even when the state itself was being corrupted, because they stood up to the state. They stood up to the executive. And that was one of our lines of defense. The second one is the social security, where government was building houses for people, bringing electricity, zero rating electricity, and so forth. So that's a success story. Of course, it has its own challenges. Then our role in the global multilateral institutions. South Africa was now chairing the AU. It was instrumental in the establishment of the African Union to replace the Organization of African Unity. It's been active in the Security Council, even as a temporary, member. Just like now, South Africa is joining again for a period of 2 years. We did manage to get the chair of the African Union Commission, the first woman to be the case. So all those, being a member of BRICS and so forth. The other day somebody said, how dare South Africa becomes a member of BRICS countries? You are so small compared to India, China, and so forth. And I jokingly said, you know what? We had a Mapunguba kingdom before even colonialism. And we're trading with Asia, so this is a reunion. It's not something new. But now the key issue, which I have raised sharply with government, it's one thing to be given a spot in those multinational bodies, even leadership position. Have we had a strategic inclination to make an impact out of it? Because I was saying when we were advising the Department of Foreign Affairs or International Relations, it's not enough to say we had a chair in the AU. You must be clear during that period. What are the 3 or 4 things that you wanted to effect? Were you successful in that? Because just chairing for the sake of chairing, it's just not going to make an impact that you intend to have. And that is also due to the lack of clarity in terms of national interests, which is the basis for your strategic intent. But now there are areas of obvious failures in our transition. The most glaring one is the socio-economic transformation. In Maine, the apartheid geography is still there. And South Africa has become one of the most unequal societies on earth. And paradoxically, this happens under the watch of a liberation movement which had a tradition of egalitarianism, which to some degree suggests that instead of transforming the institution that they inherited, they might have misunderstood, underestimated how hegemonic power structures function and got assimilated. It was a few people, mainly politically connected, who became billionaires, multimillionaires, and so forth. But the structural issues had not changed in any fundamental way. In fact, one of the failures has been the one of creation of jobs. Under Thabo Mbeki, South Africa had managed to have a 9-year sustained economic growth, managed to pay off the debt, managed to accumulate some reserves. But unemployment levels remained generally the same, which means you had a growth without inclusive development. And one of the failures has been the black economic empowerment, because failing to create a genuine black or African business class has been one of the main yawning gaps in this. So when we talk unemployment, mainly it's your youth and women who are most impacted. In some places, you have almost 60%, especially in the rural areas, of youth unemployed. And as a result, many people have seen politics as one way of social mobility, because you do not have other opportunities, so you'll fight to death just to cling into a position. And ultimately that has impacted on the internal democracy within the political parties. Because you can imagine, in politics you don't have interviews, you don't have any assessments or qualifications. You can move straight from being a touter for taxes into being a minister with those huge salaries, the lifestyle. Now you come at the end of 5 years to tell the person that all that will be lost. Then you're not speaking the same language. All these over time have created a crisis of legitimacy for the ruling party and for the project transition. And people are beginning to question some fundamental aspects of the transitional process itself, if it could not yield the benefits, the promises of liberation. We've seen the resurgence of identity politics, which was to be expected. Once you have scarcity of resources, people retreat into their primordial, sources of identity to mobilize. Not only within the different racial groups, but also within even the African majority. We've seen the rise of the right-wing, groups like the AfriForum, that apparently Donald Trump trusts their information on the issue of land. So, in all this, I'll just highlight a few things that occurred. ANC, the ruling party, has been the dominant player since 1994 or even before. So the crisis within the ruling party impacted on the country, because it has been a one-party dominated system. One of the challenges within the ANC has been the patronage system, which led to the rise and the personalization of power and the weakening of institutions. It led to the weakening of internal democracy within the party itself. Of course, when ANC sneezes, other parties which are breakaway often go away with the same genetic diseases from the mother body from which they broke. So it's not just it's just that the size of the ANC amplify some of these weaknesses. Factionalism within the ANC, and also the transition we saw between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma. ANC had always been a genius in managing transitions within itself, even managing contradictions, but this time around things didn't work well. I wrote a chapter of a book on that. I'll be happy to share when I wrote on the Polokwane moment. And I'm writing something now on the changing character of the liberation movement. But also within the ANC, what we're experiencing are some of the struggles of different cohorts of leadership transition which are not well managed. When Mandela's came back from Robben Island, we knew that the most senior layer were those people who were the Mandela generation from Robben Island. When he left the stage, it was the exile element, especially those who were the political leadership of exile in Zambia. When Zuma ascended, it was the exile military element. But for the first time in the ANC conference last year, we saw the top 6 completely excluding the exile element. It's both generational, but also there are political dynamics to that. I wouldn't bore you with some of the details. Perhaps I'll just respond to some of those when we come to them. We finally had the ascendance of Cyril Ramaphosa in December conference, but with the narrowest of margins, which means ANC remains a very divided party. His hope for consolidation may be based on something else. There is currently an investigation into what we call the state capture, the corruption, which was there. And most of his opponents are likely to be implicated, and some are being implicated. So as they get weakened by this judicial process, he may have the space to consolidate. But at the same time, ideologically, the pressure for socio-economic transformation is such that whoever is the leader, they have to do something about that, because now it's coming from below. Very quickly, on the opposition side, we do have the Democratic Alliance, which is often viewed suspiciously as a party representing the old white interests. So it's been struggling, even when they try to change leaders, to unshackle this perception. And it doesn't help them that during campaigns you see these black leaders like Maimane going from township to township, and when they are negotiating coalition politics, then suddenly you have James Self and other white leaders coming to negotiate the percentages and the deals. And now they are having their own internal crisis that they are dealing with. In fact, they've been limping from one crisis to the other. So some of the challenges facing the ANC and what could be perceived as a decline does not necessarily translate into the advantage for the opposition, because it's also undergoing its own internal challenges. Then we do have the new kid in the block, the economic freedom fighters. Been quite radical, abrasive. They have changed the character of politics in South Africa, especially the opposition politics. However, many indicators are such that Some people, especially in the margins of society, would love to support them, but they don't quite feel comfortable to say they'll be the next government. So they see them as a pressure group. Even the coalition politics, because the opposition party knew they couldn't take the ANC in one take down, they would rather work with the other opposition parties. In the local government elections in 2016, opposition parties came together in the big metros, which are the economic hub of the country. They were able to drive out the ANC through coalition arrangement. Not because any party had won any majority, but because parties were combined to come together to change governance there as a response to Jacob Zuma corruption and scandals and so forth. When Jacob Zuma left the stage, the opposition parties didn't have a strategy to deal with the new leader, because Zuma was a gift that kept on giving. They didn't need to mobilize. He was mobilizing for them. And that reminds me of someone around other part of the country. You just had to wait for him to make yet another mistake, limping from one to the other. Now coalition arrangements are collapsing all over because these had different ideologies, different interests, but combined or joined by this common, intense opposition to the then leader. I just want to conclude, before we reflect, of course, by saying there are some hopeful signs. Despite the many challenges that we see, we've seen the resurgence of the civil society and the NGO community as a critical factor. We saw it during the HIV/AIDS, fight, the TAC, and we've seen the independence of the judiciary, and the Chapter 9 institutions are still playing a very critical role. But one of those which has been the most potent weapon in the past, if you were a minister, if you were head of some government institution, you would simply go into courts, appeal and appeal and appeal for years, spending millions. This time around, judges have gotten around that particular hurdle. If they believe you are appealing not based on any rational policy interests, then they award, you pay for the cost. All of a sudden, we've seen now a sudden drop of any appeal, because people say, what if I end up paying these millions? Then you're also seeing a youthful sign, a hopeful sign, because the youth, as you saw in the last 3 years at the universities, calling for fees must fall, calling for transformation, calling for insourcing of contract workers. The youth activism, which has always been a very potent weapon in any society to transform. You'll remember in South Africa, when ANC was getting lethargic in the 1940s, the Youth League came up. They forced them to refocus. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the Black Consciousness movement of Steve Biko also energized, and it is the one that injected even numbers of people to join the ANC, the PAC in exile. And we saw in the 80s again the same thing. Now we're seeing the youth taking their space and forcing the older generations to confront questions they had promised but they had not delivered on. So that in itself, I think, to me, it's a hopeful sign. We can debate the methodologies being deployed. I was a student activist went into prison several times in the 80s, late 80s. But now I became an academic unionist. And now, being in management, I was deployed back to deal with the students across the country. And it's been quite interesting, but I'll share that one tomorrow to be very vibrant intergenerational engagement on the issues. And also in the region itself, you have seen changes in Zimbabwe. You have seen changes, in Mozambique. We're seeing changes in Ethiopia. We're seeing changes right across. And there are elections coming in Nigeria, elections coming in Malawi, in many other places. So you're beginning to see some continental developments, of course with mixed signals, but providing an opportunity, to have a resurgence of Africa in this moment. We embarked last year, when we realized there was crisis, on a project where we said we collected a number of influential people. What must we do so that we don't join the lamenting brigade? We do something. So we established the Indlulamity South Africa Scenarios 2030. And that in itself was meant to refocus the country into a strategic conversation about the future. During that 12 months, it's been one of the most amazing journeys because it has taken us to meet with all political leaders, from the president who gave us his 3 hours, to the ANC leadership, the opposition leadership, IFP, EFF, the labor union. We even brought in some of the people like Dr. Mampele Rampele and others who were involved in the previous scenarios to say, how can we improve on this tool? The reason we wanted to move the country away from its focus on this headline and that headline and focus on long term, to say these are the possible scenarios and the intervention is needed. We've published the first draft. Now we're doing the road shows where we're getting more input. We even met with unemployed youth to get something from them to say, from your perspective, because they are often spoken about, but we don't give them the narrative justice of hearing what they are coming up with. Out of that exercise, 3 things seem to be very important before I sit down. The first one is inequality. What is driving politics in South Africa today is the issue of inequality. Inequality of access, inequality of asset, ownership. There was even the rich black middle class. They are often 2 salaries away from poverty because they do not have asset. And that has created a crisis. The access to universities, the opportunities, access to jobs, and so forth. Access to land. So it's key that even in the next elections, the issue of inequality is going to be a primary driver of everything, almost. Until the country has a handle on how they deal with those issues, then we are going to have challenges. And South Africa is one of the most unequal societies, and the reasons are not hard to find. Even by market standards, you can't have competition. You can't have a competitive economy. We have 4 banks that control virtually 98% of the financial, institutions. We have in the healthcare sector the same concentration. Mobile telephones, just 2 players. Mining, just 3-4 players. So in every one of those, energy, which is under government, ESCOM, just controls everything. So the risk element, because of that over-concentration, is so high. And yet, if you want to create jobs, you need to have your small, medium. Everywhere else, those tend to absorb more because they are labor intensive. But the big industries are capital intensive. You will inject 10 billion only to employ 200 people. But if it's small businesses, it tends to have a different, dynamic. So the country will have to deal with that. The second key driver that we came up with in the scenarios 2030 is the one of institutional and leadership capacity to deal with these problems. Very often, at this moment, lacking. You have seen policy turnovers in South Africa. When RDP policy comes, 3 years, 4 years, it's gone. GEAR policy comes, it's gone. ASGISA, GIPSA, new growth path, new economic development plan. Most of them, there is a turnover. And sometimes those coincide with a change of leadership within the same ruling party. And yet your investor community needs consistency so that they can predict their own chances of making money when they invest. And when I talk of institutional and leadership capacity, I'm not just referring to government alone. I'm referring to the corporate sector, I'm referring to many others. We met with the former leaders, former presidents. One most revealing was with former President Thabo Mbeki. He said, I assembled a team of economic advisors from Harvard, from everywhere, Oxford. And one of the things, somewhere from the private sector, they made an observation and said, your economy in South Africa is rather strange. I said, why? They said, we've never seen a country so saturated with money, which is not being invested back to the society. Said, your businesses are on strike virtually, investor strike, inside the country. And they went on to say, your banking sector in particular, even if there was a global meltdown or crisis for 10 years, they would survive without going out to borrow a cent. That's how cash flashed they are. And I've raised the same thing with the private sector to say, here is a crisis, and government has been changing policies to accommodate you. But it is said that you are simply sitting on your cash, so it means you don't believe in this project. I met with the CEOs of the mining sector. I met with the Chamber of Commerce and so forth. And indeed, some of them said it's true. There's a place in Stellenbosch where they said it has the greatest concentration of wealth on earth per square kilometer. And now you can imagine, on the other side is poverty. That's why when you go to places like Sandton, Bishop's Court, we have one of the most gated communities where walls rise up 5 meters. Inside those walls, there is a school, there is a hospital, there are shopping malls, there's everything. You have to be scanned to get through. And literally, there are helipads so that they can fly over the squatter camps. If you're flying to Cape Town at times, you can see the proximity of wealth and poverty. Visually, you look through the window of your plane, you see swimming pools, you see everything else. And there are some people with farms where you drive your quack bike until you run out of fuel. Whereas the same farm, you could put in 3 townships or more. It's simply not sustainable. So because of that, you then need institutional and leadership capacity to deal with the issues. Resentment, resistance, and reconciliation is another thing that came out quite strongly in reaction to these other two. I think let me stop there so that we can engage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Somadoda, for really interesting and penetrating perspectives from South Africa. And I know you covered a lot of territory, and we've got a room full of people that are eager, I think, to ask you some questions and get some of your perspectives on some of those questions. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our live stream, we use the microphone so that people watching on the live stream can hear your voice. And Dr. Fikeni has a mic right on his lapel, so we'll be passing this around. Please do use it so that your voice will be heard. And I think we'll take 2 or 3 questions and then let Dr. Fikeni respond. And I think, Lisa, would you like to carry the mic?
Thank you so much, Dr. Fikeni, for a really, really interesting talk. I'm interested, you talked about the sort of tendency towards monopolies or tendency towards huge conglomerates, but you didn't mention the media. And the media, I think, is another place. You have Naspers and Independent and Africa Black Star, or TISO Black Star. And I just wanted to sort of hear, I've been thinking a lot, you already drew a comparison between our president and the former president of South Africa. And I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of the media. So you have this attempt, I think a sort of a pioneering attempt in world history at this sort of fake news with ANN7 and the New Age and later on, BLF and all that stuff. There's a lot of this effort to sort of manipulate the media and create this narrative of distrust of the media. Now, the South African media at the same time is subject to these kind of, it has its own issues. So I'd be interested to hear you comment on that.
Let's take a couple more, and then if that would be all right with you, to be sure everyone gets a chance to ask a question.
Baba Fikeni, thank you so much. The last time I saw you, I was at UNISA with Dr. Gruppa. So it's good to see you here in the United States at MSU. As you know, mothers of South Africa have contributed to the international and national profile of South Africa, whether that's Winnie Mandela or Albertina Sisulu. At the same time, women continue to be victims of political liberation, whether that is the silence of their voices or sexual assault. Can you tell me, what are we doing to protect the participation of women nationally and internationally in South African politics? Thank you.
Why don't we start with those 2 questions? I think they're both pretty big.
Yes.
And then, is there another person ready to go?
Over there.
Okay, yeah, let's take that.
Right
We'll
here.
take that one. Let's take that one over there, and then.
I was just saying you could take those 2
Okay.
after these 2.
Sure. Okay, perfect. We'll take these 2, and then we'll take 2 more.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. In terms of the media, it's a very important role player, but there is one important distinction. In South Africa, the efforts by the ANC to establish a ruling party-friendly media has always failed. New Age was one minor player in terms of viewership, or the ANN7 television. And it was not even commercially viable because it was dependent on adverts from government, some linkages there. So you wouldn't have a similar situation like Fox News here and several others. So it was an abortive attempt. And you know now that both New Age and ANN7 have been shut down. One removed from the satellite bouquet of television channels, so it's no longer there. But South African media It's a lot more complex than that. When you talk of NASPERS emerging from your old apartheid Afrikaner, arrangement, some of those have not changed in a fundamental way, though they've become a lot more complex, more nuanced. Let me give you a simple example. In South Africa, if you read media, the only party that is corrupt, it's usually government, by extension, blacks. When you have Steinhoff, which is your Stellenbosch company, getting into corruption, or KPMG, or McKinsey, those are global multinationals, the word corruption is hardly ever used. You are told it's collusion. During the World Cup construction, the big companies swindled billions of money. And when Tiger Brand changed and fixed the bread prices, it was said it's an anti-competitive behavior. Most of the time, it doesn't appear in the first page. It appears on page B17, business report. Let me give you another example. The son of a very popular soccer team, the Kaizer Chiefs, was involved in corruption, involving World Cup construction of stadium in Mpumalanga. He was in the front pages, busted for corruption, detained. When the 4 big companies of construction were found in a similar situation, we never saw the faces of CEOs. No one went into prison, not even logos of companies. The story quickly, hush, hush, it was somewhere at the back. So a society that has gone through racial experiences, racism doesn't just go gone. It mutates into more complex forms in the narrative. Hence, today, this right-wing group was able to send messages to Fox News to Donald Trump, that you have white genocide, farmers are being killed. They didn't check the statistics of murder in black townships, in the farms. We just have a crisis of murder, which doesn't care whether you are black or white. But they brought it here. But see how the world reacted. There was one gentleman who wanted asylum in Canada because he said whites are being killed in South Africa. And Canada was almost warming up to say, yeah, we're so worried. And the same thing when the issue of land reform was coming up. Australia, one minister said, we're ready to accept the white farmers to a civilized world. A very ahistorical position. Then Donald Trump said, we are already seeing farms being taken. Not a single farm has been taken. It's just a debate in the society. Now that sort of reveals the underlying subconscious, subtle perceptions, which are ahistorical and at times almost racist, if not racist. So the media has to be perceived in that more complex form. But now there is another new creature called social media. What it has done, it has revealed what people think in their dinner tables after taking wine when their guards have been lowered. All of a sudden now we're hearing people, there's one businessman who said, I'm so happy to be in Greece. I am so happy, I feel free, not a single black person in this beach here. Oops. Then I said to some of them, we used to have a campaign during the, peak seasons where you say, don't drink and drive. And I say to them, don't drink and tweet because you might say things you didn't want to say. On the gender issue, I think it's one very important frontier. During the liberation struggle, it was made secondary because the race issue was the most important, so to speak. And that was a strategic mistake. Even now, the debates in the transformation in the universities, it's mainly about indigenization, decolonization of knowledge. The gender issues tend to be somewhat secondary. That is where your international solidarity is needed, because the rate of violence against women is such that it needs the same massive mobilization that we saw against apartheid. Not only that, this year we are celebrating 100 years of the birthday of Nelson Mandela and Albertina Sisulu. But very often, even within the country itself, people have tended to forget that there's this other very iconic woman as well. They focus almost exclusively on Nelson Mandela. So women continue to be a footnote in a text which is mainly male. Winnie Mandela, vilified in every form. Only when she suddenly passes that the truth comes. No, there was a mistake there was another mistake, and so forth. Because a woman, independent, powerful, not working within the shadow of a husband, was not sitting very well within the patriarchal system. So those are some of the dynamics which can connect, and they are not just confined into one country. But the key question is, does the world have the appetite to mobilize the same way they mobilized against slavery, racism, and so forth, against genocide, when we're dealing with the gender issues? More potent that today you are having the hearing in Washington. Not the hearing itself, but how the reactions, even before the hearings, reveal some ethnographic layers of psychology towards gender relations. Thank you.
Lisa, we have the next two questions.
Messing with the microphone. Hope I didn't mess anything up.
So access to education is very important. Nomzam spoke about, we had dialogues, and she spoke about fees must fall, right? And I wonder, before ex-president left, he declared, free education. And what are your thoughts on the opportunities that presents for the country? And as an MSU alumni sitting here today, I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts on what collaborative posture does or should the university take as it marks its 40 years of disinvestment in the apartheid South Africa. And I use very deliberately the word collaborative, because I am not talking about aid. I'm not talking about aid. So if you may indulge me, thank you.
Hello, Soma, and welcome back to Michigan State, Dr. Fikeni. I was listening, and thank you for your analysis, but I was listening to see if you would talk about the platform and the promises of the ANC, which were discussed during the Kempton Park negotiations in the 90s. And one of the things that many South African intellectuals, such as Neville Alexander, that I worked with for many years, one of the things that late Neville Alexander is that the ANC backed off from so many of the promises and expectations that have been part of their progressive platform. I'm thinking in particular of the land question and the land restitution that was part of the promise. As you know, your former fellow student here, Dr. Tiba, was one of those people who had such a claim for many years in her family. And those issues, such as that land reclamation, land restitution, issues like that were part of the negotiations that somehow never came to pass. And I'm just wondering, is that the failure of the ANC to deliver? Is that one of the factors that can help account for the current crisis? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for these wonderfully difficult questions. Let me start with the issue of land. I think land is a metaphor for redistribution of wealth and opportunities rather than it being literal. In this particular way, the land debate has been misconstrued to mean that everybody should go for farming. Whereas younger people are saying we want land near the city to build flats, to build property, to do other things, to have assets. But most of the debate around land tend to invoke the notion of a farm in Free State. Not many people, old or young, are interested in that particular space. And we met with the National Planning Commission. I was addressing the different director generals last week on the same issue to say, let's package it differently, because people need land for different reasons. It may not be those 10 hectares, but the pressure around the cities is massive. If you go to Western Cape, I can no longer afford property in that province because most of it is over 2 million, 3 million. And most of the people who bought it are actually absentee landlords from London, the son of Margaret Thatcher, another one somewhere. And it's not even generating much for the economy because no one is there to fill gas in the petrol station somewhere, to buy something. So that's the first one. The second one, I met with the farmers, especially in the Western Cape, for the wine industries, brandy, the distill, people who are supporting that. And I said to them, you're not likely to survive this current discourse if you simply say no to land reform. Come up with a meaningful proposal. Because should you just be seen as saying no, it just won't work. But if you say this is a model that we're thinking of, it suddenly will have an ear. Within the ANC itself, there's a debate as to whether you have to change a constitution, because the constitution in the first place already made provisions for such restitution. But the problem we've been asking since 2013 Land Summit, give us statistics, how many farms are where? Under government, under commercial farmers, absentee landlords, those which have always survived through subsidies of government, they have never made any profit, and so on and so forth. Then you have a meaningful engagement on how you go about dealing with this particular matter. But at the same time, doing nothing is not an option. Many people have always said, don't go the Zimbabwe route. Fair enough. But we forget that before there was a Zimbabwe route, land grabs were already taking place in South Africa. Hence, you have squatter camps. People simply admitted themselves to places closer to workplaces and took land. You would have that on a larger scale if you don't contain and do something about that. It's just the pressure. Some people are spending almost 50% of their salaries just on transport, because the apartheid geography made sure that you are not seen after 7 o'clock p.m. You are as far away, not making noise for those who will then go to the Starbucks of that time. So now, those are some of the spatial dynamics that have to be attended to. In fact, one person even came up with something very interesting when I was engaging in the ANC policy group. He said, yeah, we can use the land expropriation without compensation. We'll say we won't compensate for your land, but if you mentor these farmers, we'll give you the same value that you would have gotten for the land. But we don't want to be saying we're paying for the land, but it will still be the same thing. So quite an interesting, engagement. So it's not a done deal that you'll even have the change of the constitution. But even if you had one, our rate of implementing policies has not been very good. It's been in the range of 30–20%. Even when you have policies in place. So that capacity to implement is very important. The political party that will capture the imagination of youth. It's very difficult to tell, because as much as the youth are quite active, the trend has been, when it comes to registering for voting and actual voting, their numbers suddenly. There is a legitimacy crisis about our system, because the participation levels have been declining. How to energize and recover that is very important. Yes, many assume that the economic freedom fighters, but economic freedom fighters appeal to a particular constituency. It's not a universal one. But their constituency is so energized, is so intense that you'd start believing that they may win 60%. And I've always warned people that don't look at the size of the stadium crowd or the intensity of songs to predict election outcome. It was the case with the UDM, it was the case with Malema and so forth, the Economic Freedom Fighters. But the one advantage they have, when they were expelled from the ANC, they took the whole infrastructure of youth from the ANC, including policies. By the way, they have not done much to change many things. They simply refurbished the same policies they had and amplified them. You have the DA, which has somewhat youthful leadership as well. As to whether that will translate into capturing the youth, it's anybody's guess. But at the universities, the EFF, or the Economic Freedom Fighter, has done well. That has not translated into the by-elections or into the elections beyond. So to me, I do think that the issue of youth participation will still be a very important factor as to whether they take their steps to the logical conclusion. On the issue of free education, to start with, that announcement by President Jacob Zuma was quite an opportunistic one. It was made 6 hours before ANC went into elections. And I bumped to the finance minister then. He had no clue that the president had promised to dispense so many billions. Even today, they are still having a crisis as to where do we get the money. But to me, that's not even the most fundamental problem. Once you have those people having gotten their degrees, do you have the absorptive capacity for them to be employed? Because you could just be postponing a crisis. But even more important, in the context of fourth industrial revolution, what will be the future of work? Here is a country with a massive unemployment, largely low skill. It needs labor intensive. Your fourth industrial revolution, high tech, and all or most of your routine jobs being replaced by machines. In fact, some of the universities, in response to the strikes, they realized it was disruptive and so forth, have gone online. So that when there is a strike, you continue submitting assignments. And I'm sure, Nomzamo, what will be the future of strikes within the fourth industrial revolution? Where you can't tell who has admitted or submitted, who has been talking to the supervisor. As people adapt, and I was saying to the labor union, start reflecting on these issues. I was addressing a poultry association conference, and they were showing machines which were solar-powered robots picking up fruits from trees, going underneath, putting them in the boxes. Remember, a machine doesn't go on strike. It has no sick leave. It has no relatives. It doesn't attend funerals. Nothing. It doesn't go for lunch. What will be the future of work? And Toffler says in the future trends, illiteracy of the 21st century will not be your inability to read and write, or even numeracy, but your ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Because we're entering a space of very complex, fluid environment, which need innovation, adaptability, dealing with complexity, including the soft skills. In one Harvard review, I read that they said, in 30 years, you might get a very expensive degree, having worked for 5 years. 1 year into your work, that degree will be obsolete. you'll need to be retrained, because everything you learned will have no relevance. So we are having to deal with this historical backlog, but having to position ourselves in a deliberate manner and begin to think, what will be the future of a student? What will be the future of work? What will be the nature of universities? Are we even there to prepare ourselves for these mega trends? We have not even spoken about environmental issues, as if we have planet B. And we have none of that. So I do think that that is very important. Even in the partnerships that we're talking, we should be saying, what's the nature of partnerships that will take us to the next level to respond to the developmental challenges? For example, my university, since 2011, we started a program of training election management officials on how to manage democratic elections. And now we are almost having 40 countries participating every year. And out of comparing their notes, we visited some of the countries like Zanzibar. Immediately they were changing their policies because they've seen best practice elsewhere. So those are some of small, modest initiatives that we could be saying, Michigan State University, how do you put together your resources and your intellectual capacity to partner with the other institutions on the other side? Because this university has an advantage of these international programs. And that, to me, would be a fitting legacy of our institutions on how we strive for social justice using the knowledge base that we have. ANC and negotiations. That's the current debate in the country. But within the ANC itself, there is an admission that perhaps some of the things that they considered they ought not to have. But of course, the political pride is such that it's very difficult to critically introspect. They say, situation have changed and so forth, but the debate is beginning to examine the transition itself as to whether we pitched it at the same level, at an appropriate level. We understood the character of hegemonic power. Some of the leaders are admitting that we overestimated the enemy, that we made concessions. But of course, before we become too harsh to them, their considerations were not just based on what was happening in South Africa. We should be mindful of the fact that ANC was retreating, all the neighboring countries were having this war fatigue, the military bases now were in Uganda, and many other countries, the continent, the world were saying, please negotiate, accept something. And the global system itself, your Soviet bloc, your East bloc had collapsed, the Berlin Wall. So those are some of the realities that within which the negotiations were taking place, and a revisit. But of course, we can't drive forward using rear view mirrors all the time. We should use the windscreen. We can reposition. The key question, what is to be done now to correct some of the flaws? Thank you.
Thank you so much once again, Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, for going deep into complex issues, and thanks to the audience for asking tough questions. I think we've had a wonderful start to the series of events that will be taking place today and tomorrow.